Hi, I'm Paul. I'm the bass player who sometimes talks. Last week we started a series on early Genesis. And if you were here, you know I'm afraid we dwelt mostly on negative things during that sermon, which was entertaining. We looked at many of the ways that Christians get early Genesis just plain wrong, and I gave some examples of the silliness and the tension and the pain and the false choices that flow from that wrong reading. And I ended last week with a more hopeful idea that looking at early Genesis in its original context will help us more clearly hear its intended message, and therefore help us focus on what the points of early Genesis are supposed to be, as opposed to the distractions of the culture wars that we have imposed on the text. So to start with that hopeful work this morning, we need to begin by talking about the ancient Near East. Now, I know that I've brought this up before. When we were looking at Law and Covenant, we talked about how Israelite laws differed from those of the surrounding ancient Near Eastern cultures. And I mentioned the ancient Near East again last week, but this week we're going to get into some more details. So, why talk about it so much? And I'm just assuming, Ben, that you did not get the images for the sermon. Yeah, that's right. We have an illness in the chain. So, if I could, I would put a map of the ancient Near East up there, and it would be focused on the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, centered on what we often call the Holy Land. And you would see that it would go over as far as what we might call India, and over to the right and to the left as far as what we call Egypt. And you would see a timeline that goes from about 3,000 years before Christ to about 500 years before Christ. That's the time and the place of the ancient Near East. If you remember learning about the Fertile Crescent, that's right in the middle there. And that is so important for us because the entire story of the Old Testament takes place in the ancient Near East. Names like Egypt and Jerusalem and Assyria and Babylonia and Persia. Just listen to this story and listen to how it is set in the ancient Near East. Abraham was called by God to leave Haran, which is right at the top of the Fertile Crescent, and travel to Canaan. That's where Jerusalem is located. He settled there, and then we get the famous 3 generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob had many sons. One of them was Joseph, and eventually, due to a famine and all sorts of family dysfunction, everybody moved down to Egypt, which on the map would be in the lower left. After 400 years of slavery, the Israelites, under the leadership of Moses, made their way back to Canaan, the promised land, which is kind of right in the middle of the map, and spent centuries trying to settle in, trying to figure out how to be a nation. At first without kings, and then with. But not long into the era of the kings, a tax dispute, of all things, divided the nation and weakened the Israelites, so they were not prepared for the onslaught of the 3 empires that swept through their region. The Assyrians came first, and they destroyed the northern Israelite nation. And then the Babylonians came next, about 100 years later, and destroyed the southern Israelite nation and conquered Jerusalem. And when they did that, they took away anyone who was elite and powerful from the Israelites and took them to the city of Babylon. They destroyed the temple. They knocked down the city walls. And then about 100 years later came the Persians, who said everyone can go home if they want to. So people went back to Jerusalem. And as the Old Testament draws to a close, the Israelites are rebuilding Jerusalem's city walls and rebuilding the temple, and they're basically trying to get back on their feet. And little do they know, as the Old Testament closes, that 2 other empires are just over the horizon, the Greeks and the Romans. My word. How did you even do this? Okay, go to the next one then. Do you have the next one? There they are. The whole story that I just read you takes place there. Fantastic. Okay. And keep that up there. That's fantastic. All right. All that I just read you from the Old Testament takes place right here on this map during this time and place. So if we are going to talk about original context for early Genesis, we have to start here. And there's something else that's really important. All of the ancient Near Eastern cultures that surrounded the Israelites during this time already had creation stories, already had flood stories, already had genealogies with ridiculously huge lifespans, long before the time of Moses. So early Genesis did not invent creation stories, did not invent flood stories, did not invent genealogies with huge lifespans. Those things were already existing literary forms. Instead, what early Genesis did was transform them for theological reasons, to teach the ancient Israelites deeply foundational things about God and about the world and about what it means to be human. Now, I can just say that, and I'm standing here behind this wooden thing, so, looks important. But if you don't believe me, maybe you'll believe the NIV Study Bible. I'm not saying that's the ultimate reference. I'm using that one for a reason. Those of you who follow such things will know that the NIV Bible translation cannot be accused of being a powerful, progressive, and liberal force in Christendom. No, catering to the evangelical world, the NIV does not like to take risks. And yet, even there, even in the NIV Study Bible, you can't even get to the beginning of Genesis without flipping through pages of ancient Near Eastern documents being listed that the NIV Study Bible tells you straight up are important if you really want to understand the Old Testament. And if you pay attention to the dates they give you, they also tell you that these ancient Near Eastern texts come well before Moses. And then, when you do actually start reading Genesis in the NIV Study Bible, the very first study note in the whole Bible is a long one explaining how early Genesis works, and it works, they say, in contrast with the ancient Near East. So then, the question obviously becomes, what was normal in the ancient Near East? What is it that early Genesis is contrasting with? What was normal in this time and place? Okay, the next picture should be black and just gone. We will come back. One more spectacular image for you. The cultures of the ancient Near East were like virtually all human cultures. They had big questions. They had huge questions. And here are what I call the big three. What are the gods like? And that would have been plural in the ancient Near East. What is the world for? What are people for? Now here's what we modern folks do when we explore those huge questions. We write essays. We write papers, and journal articles, and books. We divide ourselves up into academic departments. But what did the people of the ancient Near East do? They explored the big three through what we now call mythology. But mythology can be a misleading term. It makes you think fiction, made up, not true. But for them, theology was serious work. It was what we separate into religion, cosmology, anthropology, ethics, sociology, political science, but it was all together, and it was all in story form. So, by studying their mythological stories, we can recreate the ancient Near Eastern answers to the big three. And here they are. What are the gods like? Well, not great. They are extremely self-centered. They fight and seduce and betray each other. Their wishes change. They are fickle rulers. Sometimes they demand a particular thing, and then maybe the very next day they prohibit that very same thing. What's the world for? The world was created by the gods to be a place of rest for the gods. And they kind of had to, because chaos is everywhere, and usually represented by water in their mythology. So the world is basically a mostly safe bubble where the gods can relax for a little while and kick back in their divine lazy boys. But chaos is still very much alive and well in the cosmos. The chaos waters still surround this world, not only on the sides, but above and below. And often, a sort of chaos monster, or chaos dragon, lives in those waters and threatens to undermine the creative work of the gods. So while this world is a place of rest for the gods, it is a tentative rest, even for them. Their struggle against chaos is never finished. So then the third, what are people for? People are here because the gods were getting sick and tired of all the work that had to be done to maintain this world. The gods wanted relief from that hard work, so they decided to create human beings to do the hard labor. Quite simply, humanity is a slave class. That is why we are here, and hard labor is what we are for. But again, don't take my word for it. Let's let some ancient Near Eastern people speak for themselves. I'm going to read you 3 of their creation stories. They're short excerpts. And again, this is all from well before the book of Genesis was a twinkle in anybody's eye. First, from an ancient Akkadian creation story. And as we join this story, the various gods are getting tired of all the work they have to do, so they come up with the idea of creating humans as a servant class. And we read, "The goddess they called to inquire, the midwife of the gods, the wise Mami. And they said, 'Thou art the mother womb, the one who creates mankind. Create then the savage, the first man, and let him bear the yoke. The yoke he shall bear. The work of the gods mankind shall bear.'" Next, from an ancient Babylonian creation story. And at the beginning of this epic, all that exists is a swirling mass of primordial chaotic water, very typical of the beginning of creation stories. Then gods emerge. They rapidly become poorly behaved. Lots of murderous god-like soap opera follows, including a failed uprising against the powerful god Marduk. And then we read, opening his mouth, Marduk says, "Blood I will gather and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Indeed, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods." Why? So that the gods might be at ease. And a third story will be from an ancient Egyptian story concerning the sun god Ra. But first, you should know that each major temple site in Egypt had its own creation story. The stories went something like this, all of them. At first, there's nothing, again, but chaotic, dark, primordial water. Then a primary hill rises up out of the waters. Some gods set up shop there, and their work of creation starts from that hill. Each city had its own story, celebrating its own hill, justifying the existence of its own temple. And each temple was designed to represent the entire cosmos. So, to the story, Ra appears on a hill and says, "I came into being in this land, whereas the other gods stayed in the chaotic waters. They brought to me my eye with them," and the E is capitalized in this translation in from I, because it's a special creature. After I had joined together my bodily members, says Ra, I wept over them. This person has body issues. Why is he weeping over his body? Because he had forgotten to include the special I, which is often depicted in Egyptian art as a kind of independent, divine being. Then we read, that is how men came into being, from the tears which came forth from my eye. My eye was angry with me after it returned and found that I had made another eye in its place. The jilted eye. And in another story we read, I brought into being the four gods from my sweat, while men are the tears of my eye. And we also learn that the sun god descends into the chaotic underworld every night and must fight against a chaos dragon there. And we only know the sun god is victorious when he rises again the next morning. His struggle with chaos is never finished. A theme that's common in the ancient Near East. So, what are the gods like? What is the world for? What are people for? In the ancient Near East, the answers become clear, but they're not very nice from our perspective. The gods are self-centered. The world is a somewhat safe place of rest for the gods. But chaos in the form of water surrounds us and is always a threat. People are here as a slave class to do hard labor so the gods don't have to. It sounds pretty bleak. But what's really important to remember is that all of this was normal. And it's against this normal backdrop that early Genesis does its important work. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to read you the first creation story in Genesis. There are two. I'm reading from chapter 1. This is the story with the 6 days, or 7 if you count the resting. I will be pointing out some things as we go. Really won't take long to read. But in general, I want you to listen for these 3 things. First, listen for the delight of God. We will hear God say, we'll hear this phrase, God saw that it was good, over and over and over again, culminating in very good at the end. Like the cup of delight is overflowing by the time we get to the end. Second, what is God delighting in? The world. The world is good. Notice it doesn't say God said that it was good. God saw that it was good. That's different. And God wants more of it. Be fruitful, multiply, basically have babies. And third, I want you to listen for how humans are most definitely not slaves. Through the phrase image of God, we will hear that all humans, male and female, all humans have the same special status, the same special authority, and the same special task, which is being loving caretakers. In other words, if we listen alongside the ancient Israelites who were surrounded by the bleak, normal, ancient Near Eastern worldview, we're about to hear some, if I can borrow the phrase, good and very good news about God and the world and what it means to be human. We're about to hear some astonishing answers to the big 3. So here we go. A reading with interruptions. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. When I read this aloud to my students, almost always I'm interrupted by someone who says, "What water? God hasn't created anything yet. How can there be water?" But you've heard what it is now. This is the normal ancient Near Eastern beginning to a creation story. The primordial chaos waters. That's what those are. The ancient Israelites heard it. They understood it. They knew what to expect, or they thought they did. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness God called night, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." Now, if you're really listening to that sentence, I shouldn't mean to say this again. You're not really listening if you don't say, "Huh?" A vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. What is this? What is this vault? What are the waters above the vault? They must be clouds, right? Wrong. So next image, if we can. Look at that. This is the typical picture of the cosmos for the ancient Near Eastern world. You can see how the world is a bubble surrounded by the waters of chaos. And those waters up above, that's a significant amount of water. It's like another ocean above the sky, and it explains two things actually really well. We just, on Vancouver Island, are experiencing a sort of atmospheric river, right? There's a lot of water that falls. You're going to try to convince me that that's from vapor? Forget about it. That much water falls because there's that much water up there. There's an ocean up there. So that ocean up there explains how it can rain so heavily. And it also explains why the sky is blue. It makes sense in its own way. Okay, we'll leave that picture up for a little bit. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters God called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. You might be asking, did they not have Hebrew words for sun and moon? What's all this business about greater light and lesser light suddenly? There's a reason for that, but that's coming in a later sermon. God also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw, once again, that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. And just before we turn the picture off, I'd just like you to notice that the sun and the moon and the stars are in the sky. That's what we heard in the text. That's what we see in this rendition here. So to return to last week's theme, if you are going to insist on reading early Genesis strictly literally, you probably better stay off airplanes. It's dangerous there. Okay, we're done with the pictures now. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth and across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw, again, that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful, increase in number, fill the water in the seas. Let the birds increase upon the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures." We have creatures in the sea and in the air, now land. "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then, and here comes what Pamela read to us this morning, but that was paraphrased because of an issue that we're going to talk about. And to prevent any other distraction, let me tell you right now that the us and the we in the next sentence are not some magic Trinity reference. It's just the royal we. When important people talk about themselves, they often use the plural pronouns. So then, God said, "Let us make human beings in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." And then we get the first poetry in the Bible. So God created human beings in God's own image. In the image of God, God created them, male and female. God created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves along the ground." I think I've emphasized it enough so that you can see what we need to talk about. In this English translation, we have the typical words rule and subdue. Sometimes translations have dominion over. Those words have caused problems. Some Christians have taken them to mean that we have permission, divine permission, to treat the earth harshly for our own benefit. Some non-Christians have noticed this and have therefore blamed Christianity for our environmental crisis. And while there is some truth to all those things, there are two things I want you to know. First, the Hebrew words that are translated subdue and rule are also used in the Old Testament elsewhere to describe things like setting people free from fear, delivering the needy and the afflicted, taking pity on the weak, and rescuing the vulnerable from violence and oppression. And the other thing I want you to notice is that in this creation story, all of this human rule is explicitly linked with being made in the image of God. So listen, let us make human beings in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule. And there are two mentions of human rule, but they're separated by something. They're separated by that poem, celebrating the statement that people are made in the image of God. The point being, we are to rule, yes, but we are to rule as God does, because we are in the image of God. So the question is, how does God rule? And as we keep reading in Genesis and in the rest of the Old Testament and in the rest of the New Testament, and as we look at the cross, we see that God's Rule is actually better described as loving care, with a focus on the other. That is what we are here to do, says early Genesis, by connecting human rule with being made in the image of God. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has the fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. This is the sort of vegan one verse. And at this point, if you are vegan and reading and really pleased about this, I would recommend you shut the Bible quick, because later we kind of veer from this. But anyway, and it was so. God saw all that had been made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day God had finished the work. So on the seventh day God rested. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work of creating that had been done. So there's so much to talk about in this one chapter, and not a lot of time in one sermon, so we're just going to conclude for now by just thinking about this. The big three. What is God like? What is the world for? What are people for? And through its surprising, really shocking contrasts with the bleak, normal ancient Near Eastern creation stories, this first creation story in Genesis honestly is relentlessly positive and gives shockingly upbeat answers. God is a loving creator, not self-centered, not worried about a chaos dragon, and capable of deep delight, which includes rest. The world is good. It's the source of God's delight, and it is gift. And we are image bearers. We are here to rule. We are here to rule creation, but that means two significant things. And the first is, we're not a slave class. We all have freedom and dignity and a kind of authority. And second, we're to use that special status to take care of the world lovingly, like God does, even sacrificially. And since we are invited to join in God's rest every Sabbath, being human ultimately means we are also called to delight in each other and to delight in the great art that is the world. That is good and very good. That is good news indeed. Amen.